When people feel helpless and afraid, they're much more prone to looking towards a strong man or a strong woman. So it's a worldwide trend. So we don't know. And it's ridiculous for people to predict and say, oh, America's institutions are strong enough. Maybe they are. They've never been, we don't know how they will be tested. And it is possible that we're going to see a different form of democracy, what is known as an illiberal democracy in our country. We'll have to see, and we have to be wary, and we have to. This is what my beef with the Democratic Party is. I'm a lifelong Democrat. My icon in politics has always been Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who my parents deeply admired. They grew up in the Depression. And I also, John F. Kennedy, when I was 4 years old, 5 years old when he was assassinated, had a deep effect on me. I had tremendous love for him when I was a kid. Those are the kind of Democratic icons I have. And the party that I grew up with has completely lost its soul. It doesn't fight for anything. It doesn't believe anything. It's a patchwork of different special interests, right? And so people are saying, well, maybe we just have to accommodate ourselves with Trump and we have to try and make deals with him. And I'm saying that is precisely the problem. That is precisely why you lost. It's precisely why you're in the wilderness, why you will be in the wilderness for 10, 20 years. It's because you're not fighting. The public does not see you as strong, as tough, as standing for something simple. A simple thing like, we're for the working classes, which is what you used to be. We're not for special interests. We're not for the moneyed. We're for the average person out there. This is the America we believe in. Articulate it, have a vision, and fight. And even if what you fight for is unpopular, it's okay if you lose. There are Pyrrhic victories and there are Pyrrhic wins. A Pyrrhic victory is when you win, but the cost was so high that it's really a loss. But there are losses that are actually wins because it shows the public that you stand for something that you're willing to fight. And if you're a leader, if you're a teacher, if you're a football coach, a baseball coach, a CEO, the idea that you're willing to be tough, to take a stand, and to fight for something is what energizes the group, the crowd, the company, the team. They've completely lost track of that. So no, they do not have to bend over and become accommodating. They need to get a spine and get a soul and fight back. And the thing that was the turning point for me was when Merrick Garland was nominated for the Supreme Court by Obama, and the Republicans and Mitch McConnell blocked it in a way that we've never seen before, that was legal but was nothing America had ever been through before. And they didn't fight back and they didn't do anything about it. When you show weakness to somebody who is like a Putin, and I'm not comparing Trump to Putin, don't get me wrong, but to somebody who's very strong and who's the opposite of that, that only makes them more emboldened. You have to deter them, you have to show strength, you have to show a spine. And that's the lesson I've taken from this election. I'm very disillusioned with the Democratic Party right now. There's the 33 Strategies of War,
right,
has a chapter on this.
Yeah.
And I have a section on defensive strategies, and there's a strategy on deterrence. And it's, a lot of warfare is asymmetrical. And what they mean is, one side has more resources, one side has more power. You know, a classic example of asymmetrical warfare is the Vietnam War. The United States, with all its technology, with all its fighter jets, and the Vietnamese army basically fighting on the level of a 19th century army. And yet the 19th century army defeated the bigger one. They leveraged asymmetrical warfare in a way where the weaker was able to become the stronger. But asymmetrical warfare is not just on the level of resources, it's also on the level of ethics. So if one side is willing to do anything to gain power, to win, as I can definitely say with Putin, and you're not, because you're a democracy, you have ideas, you have values, he is at a continual advantage. And you have to find a way to not lose all of your values, but to fight back. So if you're in a situation where you're facing an enemy or another party that is willing to do anything, you have to be able to have, you can't, there was the old thing of when they go low, we go high. Throw that in the toilet, please, and flush that down. That is a stupid philosophy. When they go low, maybe we go a little bit lower than we normally have, but we're going to fight. You have to show them that you're going to fight and do something equal to what they're doing so that they back off. You don't necessarily have to do it, but you have to give a demonstration that you're going to be tough, that there's a line in the sand that they cannot cross, or you're going to make them pay for it. If they never have a sense that they have to pay consequences for what they're doing, they'll go further and further and further and further. It's a deterrent strategy. And so if the Democratic Party had shown some spine back then with Merrick Garland, and they said, all right, you're blocking it, it's legal, we're now going to do something equivalent to that, where we're going to do something to you, then they're going to go, well, maybe next time we shouldn't take that step because we're going to pay a price. The other side, the enemy, the rival, has to feel that they're going to pay a price for doing something unethical or against the rules. We can't think simply about this. We have to think of they're capturing people and torturing them. What's something else we can do where we're not capturing and torturing people that's going to hurt them below the belt economically or wherever their weakness is?
Economic trade or some sort of...
I mean, to take Martin Luther King Jr. as an example, he was organizing a protest in the city of Birmingham. And he was asked to join it. I can't remember exactly which one this was. It was in the 60s. It was a very major protest that he organized. And the movement wasn't going as well as he wanted. There were some setbacks. And Kennedy wasn't passing the legislation that needed to pass. Things weren't looking good. And in the middle of this protest, the Birmingham police were being extremely violent. They had a man named Bull Connor, who was known for putting vicious attack dogs and doing anything he could to stop the protests. And this protest in Birmingham, the blacks in Birmingham were actually very reluctant to join in because they saw that they were going to get the terrible consequences they were facing. And an advisor came to Martin Luther King Jr. and said, look, I know this is something you've never done before, and you're probably not going to like the ethics of it, but we have thousands of junior high school students and high school students who are eager to join this protest. They are very angry, and they're not afraid. Let's get them involved. And people around Martin Luther King Jr. go, oh, there's no way you can do that because these kids are going to get beaten up. He agreed to it because he was flexible and he understood something. If he unleashed these students out there, and on national television, people in their living rooms were seeing young children being beaten by Bull Connor and his men, it would make immense progress for the movement. So that's an example of fighting on that level. He didn't go and start beating up policemen doing the equivalent. He found a way of adapting his ethics, his values, for a greater purpose, which was the movement. You have to be strategic in life. And sometimes that means your morals are going to get in the way. Just being pure and ideological and moral, if it means you're going to lose and the consequences are terrible, it's not necessarily worth it. So you have to adapt a little bit. A lot of people are too ideologically pure about it. So you're so pure about the Democratic Party, and now you've got Trump in power, and look what's going to happen to our environment and climate change and all of that. Look at the results. So sometimes you have to be strategic in life. Gandhi, who initiated it, we don't give him credit, but he was actually a very strategic person. He understood that this was a war against the British. It was a war for independence. And in a war, his strategy of choice was nonviolence, was pacifism, but it had to be used in the right way. He did something very similar to what I'm talking about with Martin Luther King. He had a salt march in which he wanted the British to be attacking the marchers and the protesters who were trying to, because there was a tax on salt, they were going to march to the sea and they were going to get their own salt. And the British came and they beat the hell out of them, the crap. And people in England who are also liberal-minded and think, well, we're superior to everyone because we're English, were reading in their newspapers of people having their skulls crashed in. It was a turning point in the nonviolent war. He knew when to apply it, how to apply it, and exactly the right circumstances. He was very strategic about it. So pacifism is a very powerful strategy, but it has to be used as a strategy. Well, you have to know that you're embedded in other things, that you're not alone, that you are part of something great. of some magnificent, strange, wild, marvelous experiment. You have to wake up in the morning and go, it's actually very strange to be alive. It's actually very strange to be conscious. You know, snails aren't conscious as far as we know, but humans are. What a strange, wild experiment this is. You are part of something that is absolutely immense, that goes back not 1,000 years, not 1,000,000 years, but billions of years. You and your brain were formed out of the explosion of stars, right? That's formed the universe. We haven't found life on any other planet so far as we know, and we've been searching pretty hard. There probably is, maybe there isn't. But the fact that there was a sun that illuminates this one planet just far away enough from the sun so that the weird experiment of life could begin 3 or 4 billion years ago, and that the evolution of life took all of these strange twists and turns that could have never ended up with humans. If you follow evolution, the chances of humans evolving was very, very slim. Our species nearly died out 80,000 years ago in a plague. The fact that you and I are here talking in the English language with this technology is absolutely, the odds against it are mathematically almost impossible, but it's real. So you, Michael, and everyone out there, you're part of this. You are not alone. Your atoms inside of you are atoms that are in everything. The energy inside of you is in everything. Your mind is not just simply inside of your head. It's actually enveloped in the universe, in the cosmos. So you're not trapped inside of your body. You are part of something much more immense. And so the feeling that you're part of something much more immense is a very enlightening feeling, right? So sometimes when people, in therapy go so deep into themselves that they actually get worse because they become more and more self-absorbed. It's all about themselves, my feelings, my problems, my trauma. And I often said, the best therapy is getting outside of yourself, is caring about other people, is putting your mind into your work. We were talking about that earlier. When you put your mind into your craft, that is an act of love. You're uniting with the work. I said at the one point that the highest point of mastery is that great piano, the piano you're playing is inside of you. That chessboard, Bobby Fischer, the great chess master, the chessboard was inside of his head. That's why he could see so many moves in advance. You are united, you are connected to the thing that you're studying, which is an act of love. It's connection, it's a union, right? So the best therapy in the world is to get outside of yourself and to see the webs of connections that are enveloping you in your work, in your family, in your country, in the environment, in the cosmos. That's, to me, what I'm trying to explain in the Sublime. The Sublime is something that kind of crushes the ego, which is a great thing, So the first chapter is about just facing what I just talked about, the cosmos. How insanely insignificant you are, in a way. You're like a grain in the sand. You know more than that, right? And yet, you're part of this insane, immense experiment. So that's a form of love. It's a sense of connection that takes you outside of it. It's what they used to call, or Freud would call, the oceanic feeling, that you're part of this great ocean.